I'm Lindsay France. This is Boom Bust broadcasting around the world from Washington, D.C. Coming up, it's an entire show dedicated to China. Chinese President Xi Jinping cemented his hold on power at the Communist Party's 19th Congress. We take a look at his economic philosophy, which is now enshrined in the Constitution, and his One Belt, One Road trade initiative. And who is involved in the Belt and Road system? We show you the latest countries to join the network of roads, bridges, ports, and rail lines snaking through more than 70 nations. And what does this mean for the rest of the world? My guest, former U.S. Trading Commissioner Bart Chilton, joins me to discuss the worldwide impact of such a grandiose enterprise. Stand by. Boom Bust starts right now.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome aboard.
It's a 21st century Silk Road, and if China can pull it off, it will prove even more lucrative. The materials of trade snaking around the world, ports, roads, rail lines, bridges, and logistics zones put in place by China and its forward-leaning political alliances. Some say it's a pompous projection of power and it won't work. Others say, not so fast. This is a signature feature of President Xi Jinping's China First policies. At the Communist Party's 19th Congress in China, the Constitution was amended. The party enshrined his philosophy with the title Xi Jinping's Thought on Socialism with Chinese Characteristics for a New Era. While some say the initiative is an indication of Chinese expansionism, supporters at home and abroad say the move will not only help China, but many other nations as well. RT's Alex Mihailovich joins us from Toronto with more on this. Alex, President Xi's Belt and Road policy, as we said, it was enshrined in this Constitution. Surprise for a lot of people. Tell us about that.
Well, what's interesting is that you have something enshrined in the Constitution that not necessarily is within only the borders of China. This expands way beyond the borders of China, as you mentioned. We're talking about 60 countries to be affected by this. And if you just bring up a map, you will see right now exactly what this looks like. So it's the old Silk Road. I mean, it's one of the highlights of the maneuvering here. All the way to London, we already have a train route that goes from China to there. So we're talking about transportation. We're talking about trains. We're talking about roads for trucks and cars. We're talking about maritime routes. You can see all that on this map, which is very, very clear. 60 countries. Continents include Europe, Asia, and of course Oceania, which is New Zealand and Australia. And when you look at how broad this actually is, it's basically all-encompassing, except for us here on the other half of the world, which would be North and South America. Some of the points here, and here's some interesting, like just a breakdown of what the Chinese government is saying. They're saying the opportunities are in 5 key areas here. That includes policy coordination with other nations that are all going to be a part of this this expansion of sorts. The facilities connectivity. So we're talking about energy. We're talking about power grids, etc. Trade and investment, which is pretty obvious. Financial integration and cultural exchange. Now that one's the sort of the fluffy one at the end, but any way that you turn it, this really is a project that brings China to the center of the world and connects other countries to China as an economic powerhouse.
You notice they put the fluffy one right behind the scary one, which is financial integration. What does the breadth of this project mean for President Xi's power?
Well, you know, it's something that you mentioned off the top. For President Xi, this is massive. He is now entrenched in the Constitution. This is his initiative. We haven't seen the likes of this since Mao. So for him, he's taken his stake in China. We don't see anybody coming up after Xi. There's no heir apparent after Xi. So he really is now the one and only person in China that makes all the decisions. And that could be good and that could be bad. For us looking from the West and in our democratic ways, you know, it's a scary thing, but you have to think about the way China has worked for millennia, for the past 4,000 years, be it an empire or be it a president. China has always had a very strong centralized system, and that's for many reasons. You have to talk about 18 different languages. I don't know how many cultures exist in China. It's a big country with a lot of diversity, and to keep this diversity together, sometimes you need a strong centralized government, and that's what China is banking on, and that's what Xi is banking on.
Well, he's doing very well at it, it would seem. But let's go beyond China and talk about the countries that this new Silk Road essentially is winding through. What's the effect for them? I know every country is going to be different, but there's got to be a set theme of what they stand to lose or to gain.
A lot of people are saying they're going to gain, including countries like Australia. Now, look, this is a policy to push forward it's empire building. Let's not look at it as anything other than that, but it's empire building through money, not through bombs. So what we've seen the states do in the past when they tried to do their expansionist things, this is a very different way of doing it. There is an expansionism, there is an integration, but at the same time, it's the carrot, not the stick at work here. Countries are looking at this. They know how big of a power China is. And as far as we can see, they're seeing this as an opportunity to make money. So economically speaking, for most, this is a good thing.
New style of empire building. Very interesting to see what's in store. Thank you very much, Alex Mihailovich, coming at us from Toronto.
Thank you.
One avid China watcher is not just looking at President Xi and trade. She's looking at the succession of power. I caught up with Danielle DiMartino Booth, the president of Money Strong and the author of Fed Up and In is Bad for America. Take a listen.
Well, I think that he has solidified his power base to a tremendous extent. I'm such a dork that I stayed up until midnight Eastern time last Wednesday just to see the individuals he was going to parade out onto that great red carpet with, who represent the 6 men of his standing committee. And sure enough, not one of them was in his 50s. And without getting too detailed, that means that he has not chosen a successor for 2022. He brought people out who were his peers. Xi Jinping is 64 years old, but he brought people out who I think he sees going with him over the next not just 5, but 10 years. We have seen with our own eyes the next Mao Zedong.
You have. So you really do think that it's that solid that we are looking at someone with that sort of stature that is literally just, it's in concrete?
Look, I think it's part of their culture. You don't lose face in Asian cultures. It's just not how it's done. I think that whatever the backdoor wrangling might or might not have constituted of, I don't think that the powers that be would have allowed President Xi to present himself as such a strong man, as a one man running this massive country, if there weren't many deliberations that backed that up. And he's done a splendid job over the past 5 years of solidifying China's position. So there were probably very few arguments to push back against him saying, I'm 64 years old, I've still got a lot of gas in the engine. Let's take China into a position where we supersede the size of the U.S. economy.
A lot of ambitious talk at the 19th Congress for the Communist Party. China watchers have paid a lot of attention to succession, as obviously you have as well. Let's focus, though, on the Chinese economy. It's had its credit downgraded, just one sort of bad thing it's had to deal with. China, of course, disapproves of that. How has the president been in guiding the Chinese economy?
Well, I would say he's been very forthright in guiding the Chinese economy. They recently came back to the debt market, the country of China, the sovereign debt, and that particular issue was 11 times oversubscribed. So this is foreign demand. So you see that there's a lot of optimism in President Xi's ability to thread this needle. By the same token, I don't think that there's any coincidence that in the days that followed the recess of the Congress, we find out that the services sector is slowing, that the manufacturing sector is slowing. Xi put a lot of gas into the engine to push economic growth towards that 7% mark for optics going into this twice-a-decade Congress. And now I think we're going to have to sit back and see how much of that was smoke and mirrors and what is going to be coming back in terms of backlash in the weeks and the months to come that proves that the economy was not as strong as what Xi wanted to be portrayed.
Well, speaking of, into the future with trade, what's called basically a signature feature of Xi's contribution to China's geopolitical place in the world, the Belt and Road Initiative. It's essentially Silk Road 2.0 for a lot of people.
Right.
That's what it's being called, the trade links and the connectivity around the world, covering a vast, vast area. After the 19th Congress concluded what we had in the Constitution was this wording: following the principle of shared growth through discussion and collaboration, and pursuing the Belt and Road Initiative, talking about overtaking up through 2050. What do you think of this statement and the ambition in it for this level of a trade network?
Well, I think that we have to approach Silk Road 2.0, and for that matter, the mega city that the Saudi Arabians want to build. I think we need to approach these with understanding what the underlying impetus is to build these, or what the underlying meaning is behind the vision. So we're talking about upwards of $4 trillion if you're looking out all the way into fruition of this dream of China's. But the question is whether or not they will have the wherewithal, with the foreign reserves, with the cash they have on hand, with the debt they have in their markets right now, with the next future global recession, how that is handled. It's great to dream. It's wonderful to have a vision. The question is, will their $3.1 trillion reserve be enough to actually see this vision through? And if not, is this really just something that the Chinese are putting out there in order to help solidify themselves on the economic world stage and build partnerships and joint ventures, if you will, with other sovereign nations to slowly chip away at the U.S. dominance among other sovereigns in the world economy?
Well, it seems like so much to lose, because let's say they're continuing with this plan, buying up land, signing papers, doing the handshakes through Portugal, Central Asia, Europe. It's
60 countries.
It's really actually quite astounding. What if they do lose face? Can he afford that?
Well, I think that he's going to be walking on the razor's edge, because he's going to position himself and take a strongman position. And that means that he's going to have to take ownership of what goes right and what goes wrong. And he's proven that by giving state-controlled companies more credit over the past few months, which is the opposite of the deleveraging, which is the propaganda that the government has been trying to sell, we will have to see if he's capable of holding things together, or whether he pushes himself into being more of a dictator, and we see China begin to backtrack in terms of the economic progress it's made. We've never seen a non-capitalist economy as such in modern history come out to present itself and become the dominant world super economy.
Okay, just an anecdotal question now. You
Sure.
mentioned his successors hitting that red carpet and out in front of the cameras, relatively young. How long do you think it is before one of them will sort of rise in public stature and become the obvious successor?
Well, I think that the way that everything I've learned in studying the Chinese culture and the Chinese political system, I think that that Xi Jinping will be very purposeful in having somebody who he aims to succeed him rise in public. That's just how it's done. You get more and more stature, you get a better and better position, you get a position that's closer and closer to the president, until one day the president steps aside and you end up taking over the reins. So I think that it will be a deliberate but very public process that we see here in the years that come, out to 2022, and clearly potentially out to 2027 at this point.
Danielle DiMartino Booth, president of Money Strong and author of Fed Up, an insider's take on why the Federal Reserve is bad for America. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Time now for a quick break, but stick around, because when we return, we look at how the Belt and Road Initiative will affect alliances such as the Trans-Pacific Partnership. We'll be right back.
Mark Twain said it's easier to fool people than to convince them they've been fooled. That could be why America is so divided now, because people have been fed fake news paid for by corporate interests. They beat you down until you believe their fairy tales. Well, here's a story for you. It's called The Big Picture, and it's full of facts, not fiction. Question more.
Well, they're the war hawks selling you on the idea that dropping bombs brings peace, to the chicken hawks forcing you to fight in the battles that they start.
The news hawks try to tell you that celebrity gossip and tabloid murder trials are the most important news of the day. While the hawks of advertising tell you that you are not cool enough unless you buy their product.
Watching the hawks, watching the hawks.
These are the hawks that we, along with our audience, will be watching.
All the world's a stage.
And all the news companies, merely players.
But what kind of part does RT America play?
RT America
Offers more.
RT America offers more.
In many ways, the news landscape is just like the theater.
Real news,
Fake news.
Good actors.
bad actors, and in the end, you can never outwit your audience.
So what part can we play? All the world's a stage.
All the world's a stage.
All the world's a stage.
And we are definitely a player.
What'd you have for breakfast yesterday? Why would you pick those shoes? How fast is your Wi-Fi? What's your dog's name? Why'd you name him that? What's your biggest fear in life? Ever been on a hayride? When's the last time you read a book? What would you say if you ever met the Pope? Who's the best quarterback of all time? What's one topping that doesn't belong on a pizza? Now I've interviewed you too. Question more.
If and when it's completed, the Belt and Road Initiative will wind through countries hosting more than half of the global population, the largest trade route in the world. What would this mean for other famous trade deals, though, such as the Trans-Pacific Partnership? Boom boss Bianca Fascini has more on that for us. By 2050, the countries involved in One Belt, One Road will contribute 80% of global GDP growth, according to Oxford Economics. And that's up from 68% last year, painting a bright future for the trade initiative. On the other hand, it's not so great for other major trade deals, like the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Back in January, President Trump signed an order to withdraw from the TPP over what he claims were unfair rules. And there's still a chance that he could pull the U.S. out of the North American Free Trade Agreement for the same concerns. So that puts the U.S. in a unique situation when it comes to global trade for a few reasons. The One Belt, One Road project currently includes 60 countries and is open to adding more, compared to the 12 nations originally added in the TPP. And while the TPP is simply a trade deal, China is throwing institutional support behind its venture, including a bank and investment fund. But the most obvious difference is a new infrastructure, including airports, pipelines, roads, and bridges to connect the nations included. Coupled with other problems like aggression with North Korea or conflict in the South China Sea, it's unclear how the U.S. will approach One Belt, One Road. But officials have indicated that China likely won't be adding the U.S. to its list. During a congressional hearing in October, Defense Secretary James Mattis said, "In a globalized world, there are many belts and many roads, and no one nation should put itself into a position of dictating one belt, one road." That said, the One Belt, One Road also goes through disputed territory, and I think that in itself shows the vulnerability of trying to establish that sort of dictate. What Mattis was referring to there is the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, which India says passes through the disputed territory of Kashmir. So beyond the economic competition with One Belt, One Road, it seems there could be other roadblocks to overcome before it becomes a real competitor. How does this, if we crunch the numbers, compare financially to TPP or NAFTA, just in the size of this deal? Well, it's kind of hard to make a black and white comparison here because they are so different. Very. If you look at TPP or TTIP or NAFTA or any of those trade deals, I mean, One Belt, One Road is not a deal, right? It's this massive project that's going to include all sorts of infrastructure projects, and it's going to include a bank, which some people think could eventually rival the World Bank if the project is actually successful, and obviously would increase China's presence all over the world. So they're so different, it's hard to say what it would do, but if it is successful, it would certainly be a major trade disruptor, especially if regardless of if the U.S. stays in the TTIP and NAFTA, they pull out, it would still have massive implications for the U.S. and the West. The only thing we can do right now is just sort of stay very broad. What about Europe? What effect could it have there? Well, it's not as much of a threat to Europe as it is to the U.S. for a few reasons. Even if
the TTIP falls apart or the EU doesn't establish a trade deal with the UK when they leave, which we can at this point assume is not going to happen. There are some leaders in Europe that are open to China's project. You know, they're not against having an increased presence there. However, there are other leaders that are very cautious about working with China because EU leaders want to establish that everything will happen within their rules and regulations. And right now, of course, there's no guarantee that that would happen, especially if China is at the helm. So still a lot to be determined in Europe.
I don't think there was ever any question of the U.S. joining this. Obviously, the bilateral agreements are taking over everything we talk about trade now.
Right. I mean, as far as we know, the U.S. is not considering at all joining on, but they still have to take into consideration when we negotiate our own trade deals.
Right, and of course, if this ever happens, what its stance would have to be. Thank you so much for your information on this, Boom Bust, Bianca Fascini. Let's take a look at the worldwide impact of China's grandiose BRI. The connectivity and the cooperation needed are mind-boggling. Here to discuss is former U.S. Trading Commissioner Bart Chilton. What does this say about, we've talked about the president's power, but I want to get that from your perspective, what this means and your opinion of the Belt and Road Initiative.
Well, as you say, I mean, it's one thing for the President Xi to be enshrined in the Constitution, but to have his actual initiative enshrined is a huge deal. But you've spoken about how important this is from the circulatory, transportation modes in China and in the 60-plus countries that they're building links with. But it's a lot more than that, not just the trade that Bianca spoke about, but geopolitics. I mean, this is a huge deal, overall around the world.
What about, we've seen in the United States we had trouble with any new infrastructure programs, just even getting money off the ground to deal with them, let alone the dirty details. How is it that China can actually bite off this much and chew it? It's so broad. There's so much to overcome, the finances, the culture, all of it. A lot of people are not going to want China to be buying up ports.
Right. Well, and they're starting to do that already. But they look, it's $1 trillion. It happens to be the same amount that President Trump talked about doing, $1 trillion. They've already spent several hundred million. But it's because President Xi has this, power, this mantle to go on, and it is really smart long-term strategy. I mean, when you look at it, and you've talked about, do they have the reserves to do this?
Right.
But they are looking at this over the next 5, 10 years. They're looking at it at 20 years, at 50 years. How do they position this country, which just a few years ago, or not a few years ago, but back in the 80s and 90s, China was the largest recipient of World Bank and Asian development funds. I mean, they were a developing country. Now, China by itself is larger, contributes more to other nations than the World Bank does. So they are lending people all around the world, but particularly in Asia and in Africa. And those folks are going to be indebted. The politicians, the others, they're going to be indebted. So China's sort of unspoken mantra is more trade, less fighting, and that will build alliances and allegiances far into the future.
Right, got right under the thumb. What about filling a vacuum? Do you think President Trump's relative isolationist talk is sort of China's, a chance to step up and
100%.
say, here we are?
China was already going to do this. I mean, they announced the Belt and Road back in 2013.
Yes.
But this has opened the door wider. When I say this, I mean the Trump administration. Having an isolationist view in the middle of globalization going on all around the world is a really dangerous thing. And nothing against China, but they are not just going to eat our lunch, they're going to eat our dinner and dessert too if we allow them to continue to just make these inroads when we're sitting idly on our hands saying, make America great again, but not entering into new trade agreements. I mean, Bianca was talking about the Trans-Pacific Partnership, but they've entered all these free trade agreements, 14 free trade agreements with different nations, another 5 out there pending. They're doing a lot and being aggressive about it, and we, quite frankly, are not.
What about the rest of the world, though? What is the reception to a lot of this? I mean, we're not alone in being the only ones that want to shy away from something. Not everyone is poor and need. We're not Djibouti,
But they've got to be looking at it, the other nations, whether or not it's Asia, Oceania, Africa, or the rest of Europe, by the way. I mean, even though we have the Brexit sentiment over there, you think about what they're doing, these 1,800 miles of roads, these 35 different freight lines, and high-speed rail, and new airports. It's not just going to Eurasia. Those things are going then into Europe. So Europe's got to be looking at it from a bottom line perspective. What is the economic impact? And all those goods that are produced now in central China and western China, as opposed to having to go east, from the seaports on eastern China and go through the Straits of Malacca, they're going to go west on rail, and they're going to get to Europe quicker. And it's already cheap because of labor costs in China, but then it's going to be cheaper transportation. Right. So I think the other nations, particularly in Europe, are going to be looking at this and saying, huh, this is a pretty good deal.
Not too bad. Do you think this would bump them up to the top of the heap as far as the world's economies? U.S. is one. You think this is going to cause them to overtake that?
I do, actually. I mean, they've been on the verge of being the #1 economy, U.S. is right now, but they are already, they have 90-some countries that have China as their largest trading partner. We're about 52, rather. So they're already doing well. Right. They're going to probably overtake us. As you know, we've talked about it before. They've got about a 6% gross domestic product growth. We're struggling to get to, 2.2 this year.
Right. And 6% is alarming for them.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not even where they want to be.
Down. Now,
low.
there is some question about whether or not it's really 6% or is it 4.8, but it's not 2.2 like the U.S. will be lucky to get this year.
Well, and then President Trump talks about, we want at least 3. I think at some point during his campaign he went up to 6, but he said 3 is great. Well, when you're only aiming for 3 and then China's hitting 6, doesn't matter if it's 4, it's still more than us.
Yeah, China's doing a whole lot in this regard, and this is just such a long-term thing that they are doing, and it is about the infrastructure and the connectivity, but it's also, I think, about this geopolitics that's taking place, and that is so smart of them to be looking at this. They're making loans to folks, foreign aid loans to folks. It's really going to help them long term. Good for them. I just hope that we in the U.S. don't stay asleep at the switch.
What about Trump's initiatives to, he's all about the bilateral trade talks. He's going, the Asia trip was big. And do you think that his talk about bilateral is always best can in any way get the U.S. ahead of China?
I don't think so. I mean, I had a really low bar for the Asia trip, and it was that if he didn't do what Bush 41 did and, throw up, that he was probably going to be a win.
I still remember that, right.
But the bottom line is there's more that U.S. can do, and I just hope we do it.
All right. Thank you so much, former U.S. Trading Commissioner Bart Chilton.
Yep.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to catch Boom Bust on DirecTV. In the United States, you can find us on the RT channel 321. And if you miss us on DirecTV, catch Boom Bust on YouTube, youtube.com/BoomBustRT. Thanks for watching. See you next time.